Welcome to The Explainer. The history of the United States, it's really not just some boring list of dates and treaties you have to memorize. It's actually this massive 400-year chain reaction. It's like a giant puzzle. Today, we're going to look at this history as a series of falling dominoes. We'll see how one single isolated event inevitably triggers the next, and how that completely changes the landscape of the North American continent, and honestly, the world. So, let's jump right in. Okay, so here's our mental roadmap for this explainer. We're going to move rapidly through 6 distinct eras: collision in the New World, the road to revolution, forging a new government, manifest destiny and expansion, a house divided, and finally, reconstruction and unfinished promises. All right, let's get started. Part 1. Collision in the New World. Empires and First Contacts. Long before European explorers ever arrived to map out the shores of the New World, North America was already home to hundreds of thousands of native peoples living in really complex, sophisticated societies. But as we'll see, the arrival of European powers would trigger a massive collision of cultures. Now, early attempts by the English to establish colonies, they were incredibly difficult. The 1585 Roanoke colony literally vanished without a trace. Then came Jamestown in 1607, and it suffered terribly from disease and famine. It was only saved when Captain John Smith took essentially dictatorial command of the settlement. Then in 1619, we see a profound historical shift. English privateers brought 20 to 30 enslaved Africans to Point Comfort, Virginia. And this specific moment marked the beginning of 2.5 centuries of slavery in what would eventually become the United States. And then, just a year later, in 1620, the Puritans arrive and found the Plymouth colony, searching for religious freedom. So as these European powers are carving up the continent, conflicts were completely inevitable. And this brings us to our very first major domino effect. The British Empire wins the French and Indian War, securing these massive North American territories. But this global conflict came with an astronomical price tag. To pay off that massive war debt, Parliament started levying a series of acts and taxes on the American colonists. For the colonists, who had absolutely no representation in Parliament, this felt like a direct violation of their rights. And honestly, if you've ever felt the sting of paying for something you had zero say in, well, you can understand exactly why this sparked such intense outrage. Moving on to Section 2, the road to revolution, taxation and rebellion. That massive financial debt pushed a relatively autonomous colonial population into direct, heated conflict with their mother country, completely setting the stage for rebellion. Let's see how this builds, because the escalation was remarkably rapid. In 1765, Parliament passes the Stamp Act, taxing official papers, deeds, even playing cards, and protests just erupt. By 1770, tensions in Boston completely boil over. An angry mob surrounds a lone British sentry, which leads to British troops actually firing into the crowd. 5 colonists die in what becomes immortalized as the Boston Massacre. Then, in 1773, the Sons of Liberty protest the Tea Act by dumping 342 crates of British tea straight into Boston Harbor. Parliament responds with the Intolerable Acts, bringing Massachusetts under strict, direct British control. And finally, on an April morning in 1775, colonial militiamen and British regulars face off at Lexington. An unknown shot rings out, the literal shot heard around the world, and just like that, the American Revolution officially begins. By 1776, this conflict had shifted from a rebellion over taxes to a full-blown revolution for independence. And it was cemented by Thomas Jefferson's famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." But actually realizing this ideal, it was incredibly difficult. The brand new Continental Army, led by George Washington, was severely undersupplied and struggled with bitter internal divisions. These soldiers basically viewed each other as foreigners. In fact, General Washington literally had to physically pull soldiers off of each other to break up a massive snowball fight that had escalated into an outright brawl between troops from Massachusetts and Virginia. Crazy, right? Section 3. Forging a new government, from chaos to constitution. So, with the help of the French, the Continental Army eventually forced the British to surrender at Yorktown in 1781. But winning the war didn't solve everything. It actually created a completely new problem. How exactly do 13 independent states govern themselves without a king? Now, what's really interesting about this next part is how the initial solution completely failed. In 1777, Congress adopted the Articles of Confederation, but it created a very weak central government. It couldn't mediate state disputes, it couldn't manage international trade, it couldn't even pay its own debts. This weakness became glaringly obvious during Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Unpaid Revolutionary War veterans actually occupied courthouses in Massachusetts, and the federal government was entirely powerless to intervene. This chaos was the direct domino that forced leaders to convene in Philadelphia and draft an entirely new framework, the U.S. Constitution, which established a much stronger central government. And why this matters today is that every single federal law that currently impacts your daily life stems directly from this frantic pivot. But to prevent this new, powerful central government from becoming tyrannical, they engineered a massive compromise based on checks and balances. Power was divided up into three distinct branches. The legislative branch, that's Congress, divided into the House and Senate, they make the laws. The executive branch, led by the president, enforces the laws and manages foreign policy. And the judicial branch, featuring the Supreme Court, interprets those laws. It was a really careful, unprecedented balancing act designed to distribute power evenly. And this new government was put to the ultimate test during the War of 1812. The United States once again declared war on Great Britain, this time over trade disputes and the impressment of American sailors. It was a devastating conflict at home. By 1814, British troops successfully marched right into Washington, D.C. and set the White House and the U.S. Capitol ablaze. But the government endured. There's this brilliant anecdote from the source material. Right before the British arrived, First Lady Dolly Madison had her enslaved servant, Paul Jennings, secure the famous portrait of George Washington, saving it from the flames. The nation survived. And this resilience really proved that the system of government you live under today was built to withstand the ultimate pressure test. Part 4. Manifest Destiny and Expansion. The Push Westward. So with the British officially fought to a standstill after the War of 1812, the new nation's attention dramatically shifted. The external threat of European control was fading, and the focus turned entirely toward expanding westward across the continent. This drive was fueled by the concept of manifest destiny. This was the widely held 19th century belief that the expansion of the United States from the Atlantic to the Pacific was not just a political goal, but an inevitable destiny. It's this concept of continentalism that meant boundless opportunity and wealth for American pioneers. However, we have to note that it simultaneously meant the devastating forced removal and destruction of sovereignty for the pre-existing Native American tribes who stood in the way of this expansion. So the crucial point here is understanding the sheer economic gravity of this westward push. Consider this number. $187 billion. That represents the modern equivalent value of the gold extracted during the California gold rush that began in 1848. When gold was discovered in the Sierra Nevada foothills, it triggered an absolute explosion in migration. San Francisco's population skyrocketed from just over 800 people to 20,000 in a single year as prospectors, known as 49ers, rushed in to claim their fortunes. But of course, this expansion came at a tremendous human cost. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson pushed through the Indian Removal Act, displacing over 60,000 Native Americans and resulting in the deaths of roughly 15,000 people along the tragic Trail of Tears. Pioneers braved brutal overland routes, sometimes facing unthinkable conditions. Take the Donner Party, for example, who became snowbound in the mountains and literally had to resort to cannibalism to survive. Expansion also meant war. American settlers in Texas rebelled against Mexico, highlighted by the famous Siege of the Alamo in 1836. And a decade later, the U.S. provoked the Mexican-American War, swiftly conquering vast territories, including modern-day California, New Mexico, and Arizona. Section 5. A House Divided, the Irrepressible Conflict. Adding over 1 million square miles of new territory to the United States triggered the darkest domino of all. The fragile political balance back east was completely shattered by one burning question. Would these new Western territories allow slavery? And this brilliantly illustrates how political compromises completely failed over the ensuing years. Attempts to let settlers vote on the slavery issue led to a localized civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. Radical abolitionist John Brown further escalated tensions by hacking pro-slavery settlers to death and later attempting to incite an armed slave rebellion by raiding the federal armory at Harper's Ferry. The final straw came in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln, an anti-slavery Republican. In response, South Carolina and other southern states seceded from the Union. When Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter for 34 hours in April 1861, the American Civil War officially began. The resulting conflict was the deadliest in American history. 4 years of total war left a staggering 600,000 soldiers dead. But this massive bloodshed fundamentally shifted the nation's objective. What began for Lincoln as a war simply to reunite the country and return to the status quo transformed into a war to eradicate chattel slavery entirely. In 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and the goal of the Union Army became undeniably linked to human freedom. And understanding this shift helps us grasp the deep roots of the civil rights struggles that still resonate in our society today. Part 6. Reconstruction and Unfinished Promises. In the spring of 1865, the Confederacy finally surrendered. But mere days later, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. The country was abruptly thrust into a new era without its leader, forced to rebuild the devastated South and radically redefine American citizenship. During this Reconstruction period, Congress passed 3 massive constitutional shifts. The 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all those born in the U.S. And the 15th Amendment guaranteed Black men the right to vote. But as the federal government expanded these liberties, a fierce and violent pushback emerged in the South. White supremacist groups, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, formed to terrorize Black Americans and aggressively suppress these newly granted civil rights. Now, President Ulysses S. Grant did use the U.S. military to combat the KKK, but political will in the North eventually faded. It all culminated in the Compromise of 1877. Basically, to settle a highly contested presidential election, a political deal was struck. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes was granted the presidency in exchange for the complete withdrawal of federal troops from the South. The federal government effectively abandoned its efforts to protect African American civil rights, giving way to systemic disenfranchisement, oppression, and the dark, enduring reality of the Jim Crow era. Which leaves us with this. We've seen how the dominoes fell over 400 years, from the first European settlements through a war for independence, the framing of a constitution, relentless expansion, and a horrific civil war. The United States survived its violent birth and rapid expansion, but at what ongoing cost to its own citizens? That is the complex, fascinating, and at times tragic story embedded in the foundation of the nation. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world today.